Okay. Thank you so much for having me. What a great crowd. I'm going to kind of piggyback on this March Women's History Month because lately I've been writing for about 25 years. I do Colorado history primarily, but lately I've been doing a lot of women's history. And I'm going to first I was going to talk about Ann Bassett, but then I had two books, an author's dream. I had two books that just came out within a week of each other. And so Candace was kind enough that she got them both in. So I'm going to kind of talk about all three of these. So first, I'm going to talk about Ann Bassett. Anybody heard of Ann Bassett? Yay! Ann Bassett, Colorado's cattle queen. I started my interest in Ann probably in high school, and I developed it a little bit more in college because my college roommate was from Steamboat Springs, and so I spent a lot of time up here and got to do a lot of research. She's always been probably my favorite female Colorado pioneer, but it took a long time to do the research and write about her. The book just came out in 2018. It's won 4 awards. Last year it won the literary Will Rogers Medallion Award for Best Biography. So I'm really proud of this one, and this is Ann Bassett, Colorado's cattle queen. Ann was born in 1878 in Browns Park, Colorado, which was at that time in Weld County. She was the first white child born in Browns Park. Her parents, Herb and Elizabeth, had a small cattle ranch in Browns Park. And Browns Park, I'm sure you all know, is great for cattle grazing. And Ann and her older sister Josie and her 3 brothers helped with the ranch. As Ann grew older, she kind of took over the ranch from her mother Elizabeth. There's rumors that there was wrestling done by Elizabeth. She did go to court twice, and at that time she took a buckboard to Horne's Peak, which was the county seat of Weld County. And that's what, you tell me, I got 60 some odd miles by buckboard. I just can't even fathom that. But so then Ann kind of slowly took over the ranching, and she really got interested into ranching, and she wanted to be hands-on and to be with the guys. What a hell of a woman she must have been. She drank her whiskey straight. She rolled her own smoke. She stayed in the bunkhouse a lot with the guys, learned how to do, she did everything. She wrote, she rode, she carried her rifle with her while she trailed the cattle. And then she was engaged to the head of the Cattlemen's Association, who was named Matt Rash. They were to be married, and about a year later, a man by the name of Ora Haley was a large cattle baron, and he started moving his cattle ranching operation into Browns Park in an effort to take over the small cattle ranchers. He wanted Browns Park for himself. So he started intimidating and getting rid of the smaller ranchers, and he did to some extent get rid of them, but not Ann Bassett. Until he went to Denver and hired a gun for hire by the name of Tom Horne. But Tom Horne came into Browns Park with an alias of Tom Hicks. One person who knew that he wasn't right was Josie Bassett, but we'll get back to Josie. In the meantime, Tom Horne started putting notices on smaller ranchers, places, you have 30 days to get out or else. Again, Ann she wasn't at all intimidated until one day up on Cold Mountain, her fiance, Matt Rash, was found shot to death. He had 2 30-30 gunshot, one in the back and one in the side. Everyone knew that the only person in town was the stranger Tom Hicks, but no one knew for sure what to do about it. But Ann knew that it was Ora Haley who did it, and again she rides her horse all the way over to Hans Peak to file a complaint with the sheriff at the time, who was Ethan Allen. I just love that name. The Rock County Sheriff, Ethan Allen. That's just the neatest name. But even Ethan Allen didn't think much of it and didn't do anything until 3 months later, in July of 1900, the Bassett family ranch hand had a place up on Cold Mountain as well. His name was Ice and Dark. And he was, by this time, he'd been with the Bassett family probably a good 20, 25 years. He was elderly by this time, and Josie described him as just a good old black cowboy that didn't hurt anybody. Well, he was found shot to death too, again, 30-30. So Ann knew again that it was Ora Haley that did it, and she goes, for the next 20 years, she goes on a personal vendetta. She takes Ora Haley's cattle and she stampedes them off mountains and into the Yampa River. And she just does a one-woman crusade to get rid of Ora Haley. And to an extent it works, and Ora Haley tries and tries to do something about Ann, but never can. So what he finally does, in 1911, he plants cowhide on her land and has someone come over and say, Ann Bassett rustled my cow. So Ann, by this time, goes to court in, they have a court in Craig, Colorado, so she goes there, and it takes about 3 months, and she's acquitted the first time. So they decide to try her again. Now this time it's 1913, and by this time Route County and Moffat County Route County has split, and Craig is Moffat County now. So she's tried legally in Moffat County, and again she beats Ora Haley. She goes on to own her cattle ranch and keep it for several years. She passes it to her brother, who ends up losing it. And another thing she does, to get back at Ora, she decides to marry his #1 hired hand by the name of High Bernard. She marries him. That marriage lasts not quite 10 years and ends in divorce. But at the second hearing of Ann's cattle rustling, he does testify that Ann would never do any such thing. She's a good girl, and this would have never happened. She marries for a second time, and they move to Utah and that's where they have a copper mine, and they do a lot of mining. And in the end, just in 1956, a couple months before she dies, she gives an interview to a newspaper reporter, and she says, her exact words were, "I did everything they said I did and a hell of a lot more." And that's my story of Ann Bassett. Ann was quite the braggart, and that was part of the reason. I'll tell you another little story about Ann. And that's part of the reason why it took such a long time to research her, because she would embellish a lot of her stories. But I don't think she ever did lie. There's a couple times her sister Josie, on the other hand, kind of stretched the truth quite a little bit. Another story about Ann, there's two myths about Ann. One is that she had a thing with Butch Cassidy. And Butch Cassidy was in Browns Park, did work for Herb Bassett, her father, for 1 and possibly 2 summers. But they never had a thing, because the summers that Butch Cassidy was in Browns Park, Ann was 9 years old. That did not happen. The other thing, there's rumors, and this is what finally made me write the book, is so many people say, well, you know, Ann Bassett really was at a place. Everybody know who at a place is? Girlfriend of Sundance Kid of Wild Bunch fame? Well, it's not true. She wasn't. So on the back of my book, I've got a lengthy timeline where I say everywhere Anne was, and at that time, everywhere where Etta was. Until we know that Etta went to South America and we never hear from her again. In one instance, Anne supposedly went to South America with Butch and Sundance. However, I've got a newspaper clipping of the day, on the day that the boat sailed from New York, Anne is in Grand Junction. So I've got that timeline that explains all that. So that's a little thing. Then, my next book that just came out a little over a week ago is Growing Up with the Wild Bunch, the true story of Josie Bassett. And Josie Bassett really did grow up with the Wild Bunch, and she really did have a thing with Butch Cassidy. She's 4 years older than Anne. She was 4 years old when her parents came to Browns Park, and she is more like her mother than Anne was, actually, in that she is kind of more of doing things a little bit on the sly. She actually did do some cattle wrestling. She actually did have a thing with Butch Cassidy for one summer, and she's quoted. The thing that made me really like this book that took a while to write was there are 2 taped interviews, and they're lengthy, like an hour and a half to 2 hours, and they're at Dinosaur National Monument. They were done in 1959 and 1961, and it was such a thrill as a historian to actually listen to Josie's voice. And she talks about a couple things about Butch Cassidy, but when they had their thing, she was 15 going on 16, and the summer before that, she saw Butch Cassidy at a rodeo, and I believe it was at Charlie Krause's rodeo. And she said she was smitten with him. But he didn't have a thing for her, didn't even look her where. And she came home and stomped her foot and she said, I was just so mad. Well, the next summer, they did have a fling. And they apparently, as all how cliche, in the hay barn. and the saying, according to Josie, Butch would say, I'm lonely up here, why don't you come keep me company? And Josie, in her words in the taped interview, let's just say, I kept you company. Josie was quite the character herself. When she really adored Isendard Bassett, ranch hand, and when he died, she personally went on horseback up to the mountain, found his body, and her husband, James McKnight, Isendard was living in James McKnight's summer cabin up there, and it is believed that when Tom Horne killed Isendard, he was actually after James McKnight. Again, that's according to Josie. In any case, they're the ones who found the 30-30 bullets and took them to good old Sheriff Ethan Allen. And again, he did nothing with them. She and James and a couple others buried Isendard, and his body is still up there on Cold Mountain. And I think there's a picture of it in one of the 2 books. Josie and James McKnight had 2 kids, both boys. About 5 years later, they divorced, and Craig has 2 newspapers, and Steamboat has 1 newspaper. And yellow journalism or gossip of the day, I don't know. But they were in every issue. Funny thing going on over in Browns Park, the divorce of has taken another turn. And I put the whole newspaper account in of when Josie decides that she's going to serve papers on James McKnight. And James comes out, and Josie is not actually there, but it's a deputy sheriff who is there, a deputy sheriff Ethan Allen. and he serves the papers on James McKnight, but accidentally his gun goes off and shoots James McKnight. Well, one of the papers, the Craig Daily, I forget which one right now, but they say that when Josie served the papers, Josie shot James McKnight. And Josie said, if I'd shot him, I wouldn't have missed. Josie marries 5 more times afterwards. Yeah. One of them, she is rumored to have murdered. This happened on New Year's Eve day of 1900 in Linwood, Utah, which is now under Flaming Gorge. And they went up there, she and her husband, Nig Wells was his name, and they went up there for a celebration of Christmas and New Year's and spent about 7 to 10 days up there. Now, Nig was quite the alcoholic, and Josie had gotten him on the Keeley cure, but he didn't really like doing it, so Josie did it. And on the night of New Year's Eve or morning of New Year's Day, he comes into the hotel room, which is Minnie Krause Rasmussen Renault's hotel. It's the only one in Linwood that they have to stay out. And wouldn't you know, Minnie Krause Rasmussen Renault is the arch nemesis from Browns Park High School days of Josie Bassett. They hate each other. So Josie gives her husband Nick the Keeley cure in his coffee, lets him sleep it off, comes back a few hours later, and he's dead. Well, Minnie Krause Rasmussen Renault just has a heck of a good old time. She's going to get her nemesis, Josie Bassett. She goes to the coroner. She goes to the sheriff's office. She goes to the newspapers, and she says that Josie did it. That she not only murdered him, but she stole from me. She stole from my hotel. She's a terrible person. Well, unbeknownst to Minnie, the coroner's inquest had already interviewed Josie and cleared her of all charges. So that didn't work well. So right after that, Josie brings her husband back and buries him in the Ladore Cemetery in Browns Park. She's had enough of Browns Park and Linwood and the whole Colorado, so she decides to move, and she goes to Cub Creek, Utah, which is just south of Jensen, Utah. She finds a wonderful homestead there, and she lives there with another husband, divorces him, and marries for the 5th time and possibly 6th time. There's one that I couldn't for sure figure out if they actually married, but when the second to the last husband leaves Cub Creek, what happened there was her older boys are there visiting, and she's got a horse ranch at this time. And her sons say, something's going on with these horses. I think your husband's mistreating the horses. She goes, no, can't be. My husband would never do such a thing. So she sets him up, and she goes out to the barn one night, and sure enough, he's beating these horses. So she says, you've got 15 minutes to get out of here, and she raises a frying pan and chases him off the property. And he goes to the neighbor or whatever and says, Josie gave me 15 minutes to get off the property, I only needed 5. So Josie lives through World War II, and during the Great Depression, World War II, she, like everyone else, kind of falls on hard times. And she's a teetotaler up to this time, but she decides that she's gonna, like everybody else, she's gonna do moonshine. And she makes the best moonshine, and she, of course, has to taste it all the time. She made peach moonshine, and apricot, and blackberry, and cherry, and she just said that her moonshine was better than anybody else's. And it must have been, because people came from miles around to get her moonshine. And she would sell her moonshine to get by financially, but she would also go out and shoot antelope and deer for subsistence, but oftentimes she gave away extra to the neighbors. So she was a kind, caring soul as well. Now, Josie, like her sister and like her mother, was also brought up on wrestling charges. And so she has to go to court, not once but twice like her sister, but she gets off both times. And what she told the newspapers was the reason why she got off was because by this time she's in her 60s. She said it must have been the pretty crisp little dresses and the gray hair. She lives on Cup Creek for the rest of her life. No plumbing, no running water. She goes to a creek and to a spring to get her water. No electricity. At one point, she has a fire going and she's getting kind of elderly and she falls and she can't get up, but she manages to crawl outside and grab the dog's pan, and she stays there until neighbors come, and with the dog's pan she's able to get snow, and that's as it melts, that's what kept her alive. She never was quite right after that. Her health just kind of deteriorated. She also, with the fire, she lost a portion of her cabin, and she dies in 1961, and her son Crawford brings her back to Browns Park, where she's also buried. While she was alive, she was at the age of 67, I believe it was. She came back to Maybelle, Colorado, and she was the rodeo queen. She was still riding a horse. She rode a horse till she was in her mid-70s. So she was quite a woman, and that's the story of growing up with the Wild Bunch, Josie. My last book. This is the first time I saw it. Was here today. I hadn't even seen it. This is Ranching Women of Colorado. This is the story of 17 ranching women, and there's a lot of women ranchers, but these 17 women are not married, so they're not ranching wives. They are actually ranching women. They homesteaded or got their own land and did it all on their own. One woman in here is, I think Candace mentioned her, is Elizabeth Hutchinson. She comes to Steamboat in 1894, and she is married, but for whatever reason, she gets 130 acres just east of Steamboat, while her husband gets another 140 acres up by Yampa. They end up separating, but at the time that they get these two homesteads, I haven't figured out if they're separated or not. I couldn't find that out. Elizabeth does a lot of investing. She owns a couple of mines near Oak Creek. She owns lots of property in Steamboat and the surrounding areas. By 1900, she's developed her land pretty much, and it becomes very well known for her hay crop. In about 1910, for whatever reason, and I think I have my suspicions, I think it's land and money, but her stepchildren go to Weld County Courthouse and file a claim that she is insane, and they want her checked out for this. So they do a couple of inquests, and they decide to hold a trial, and the judge at the time has never done anything like this in Rock County. So he decides to kind of think out of the box, and he gets 6 female jurors. If we're going to do this, we're going to do this right. So we're going to have 6 women of her peers judge her. And unfortunately for Elizabeth, they do judge her insane, and she's sent off to the mental hospital in Pueblo. Sadly, it just breaks her spirit, and 3 years later she dies, and she's buried in the the insane section, Pueblo Insane Hospital section of Rosemount Cemetery in Pueblo. Interestingly enough, the stepchildren, by this time she's divorced, but the stepchildren still have a say, and possibly because they're the ones who filed the charges, they end up with most of her property and end up selling for a huge profit. There's a, I can't think of the name of it off the top of my head, but there's a housing development now that was once her property out here. I don't know, because of the proximity to the highway that comes in from, if that had anything to do with it. I have a feeling it might have, to the easement to expand it might have, but by 1910 we've already got automobiles, so I don't know about, I'm sure the road was there, but maybe they're improving it, I don't know. So that's the story of Elizabeth. There's other ranching women in the area. In Grand County, we've got the Harbison sisters who homesteaded land in Rocky Mountain National Park. Let's see, Ann and Josie are both in here. We've got Twee Kimball from Kessel Rock. I don't know if you know Twee Kimball. She was the first woman who crossed Angus steers and brought in a new breed of cattle. She was the first woman on Colorado Stock Association. She was the first woman of the Western Stock Show. Her property now by Castle Rock and Colorado 85 is in, she put it just before she died into perpetuity so that it would never be encroached on, which is really good because Castle Rock almost touches my home of Littleton, Colorado. And then there's also some homesteading women in the Eastern Plains. I'll just touch on one that's kind of, anybody ever heard of Rattlesnake Kate? Rattlesnake Kate is from Weld County, near Greeley. And she divorced and had a 4-year-old boy. And during her divorce, to make ends meet, was pretty hard for her. She had a little bit of land, but she would put her boy on her horse and go out and shoot fowl off this lake. She would sell the pheasants and the ducks to help her sustain herself. Well, as she always did, she would leave her son, she would tie her son, leave him on the horse. She would tie her horse to the fence post. She would open the fence. She would take her gun, and she would go in and to shoot. Well, this one particular day, she's getting ready to shoot, and these snakes start coming out. Not one, but two. She takes her gun and she starts hitting them. She starts shooting them. They keep coming, and they keep coming, and they keep coming. She's broken her rifle now. She takes a fence post, she busts it off, and she's shooting at these. This goes on for 2.5 hours. She's just shooting. I just can't even imagine. And in the end, she shoots all the rattlesnakes, and she leaves them all there. She goes back and gets help, and these two guys come. They counted 147 rattlesnakes. Well, Kate sees a little opportunity here. So she skins them all, she makes dresses, and she makes jewelry, and she starts selling these things. And she's doing pretty good. So now she's going back out there and she's shooting more snakes. She's selling more dresses and more jewelry. Rattlesnake Kate dies in 1937, I think, and she's buried in the Linwood Cemetery in Greeley, Colorado. And that's part of them. There's many more. I kind of rambled, I know I did, but I was kind of excited to have all 3 books to talk about today. So if anyone would like to share any stories or ask any questions, let's open it up for that. Yes?
Josie, you said, died in 1961.
Yes.
And up to that point, until her death, she did not have any electricity or running water?
No. No. She didn't want it. No.
You repeat the question?
What was the question, please?
Okay, the question was, when she died in 1961, did she live that entire time with no electricity and no water? And
Josie.
Josie. Okay, I'll do better now. Yes?
It seems that rustling gets you in trouble with the law, but actually shooting, taking out your neighbor, that's
Not a serious crime.
not a serious offense.
Taking out the neighbor?
Well,
Killing, murder.
Yeah, his comment was that wrestling is against the law, but shooting or taking out your neighbor isn't. And I don't know that that's true. It's just that in the case of Matt Rash and Isom Dart that Tom Horne killed, they could never pin it on him. And then the same thing could be said that either the cattle barons got tired of Tom Horne's antics, or he really did, or they set him up. Did he really shoot Willie Nickel and get hung for that in Wyoming later? I don't know. But he was good for probably, they say 7, maybe 8 murders, maybe more. I don't know. But Josie for sure said that Tom Hicks was Tom Horne, and most everyone else believes it too. Yes?
When you refer to Cold Mountain, do you mean Cold Springs Mountain? It's commonly called?
I think it goes by both names. I think it does. A historian over there, to me, said Cold Mountain. But then I also saw on a map, I believe, that it was Cold Spring Mountain.
North of Irish Canyon and east of Browns Park, basically.
I believe it's... yeah, I think that's right. I get up in the mountains, I get all turned around. I know my direction if I see the mountains, but when I'm in them, it's different. Yes, Candace, way back there.
Can you talk a little bit about Josie Bassett's homestead in Times Square?
Somebody pass up the question because I can't hear her.
Josie Bassett's homestead in Dinosaur.
Can you talk about that? Because my understanding is that her orchards are still there.
Oh, yeah. I've been there a few times. It's absolutely wonderful. The spring is still there. Her cabin is still there. The chicken coop is still there. Another outbuilding is still there on the other side of the cabin. I can't remember what that is, but I believe it's the National Park Service has taken it over, and they've redone everything, and you can go in and see it. My author picture in the back of the Joseph book is me at the fireplace inside Joseph's cabin. And it's free to go see it. It's dirt road, which my husband wasn't happy about, but yes, back there.
One of the books I read on Ann Bassett said that she was actually born, I can't remember now if it was right before her parents moved to Browns Park or on the way. Could you comment on that? And second, this book also said that Elizabeth wasn't able to nurse her, so they had a youth lady actually nurse her for about her first year of her life, and she lived with the youths while her parents were off tending the cattle in the summer.
Her and Elizabeth arrived in Browns Park in 1876. 2 years later, she's pregnant with Anne, and Anne is born, but Elizabeth can't nurse her. So they take her to the Utes in the area, and this Ute woman nurses her. And the whole time that she does this, Elizabeth is living with the Utes too, and she likes to sing to them, and they like to hear her sing. And so they nicknamed her Magpie. The question was to ask about, for me to go in about when Anne was born, and that the Indians nursed her for the first few months of her life. Sorry, I'll do better. Yes?
Is there any truth to the rumor that Anne had broken her hair?
That Anne had what?
Broke a bridge her hair from her horse.
In Anne's memoirs, she talks about that, and I didn't even put it in the book because the more that I'm sorry. Okay, the question is there any truth to the fact that Guy, you think this is the first time I've ever done this? Okay, the question is there any truth to Anne roping a bear and possibly by horseback? In Anne's memoirs, she does talk about that. I didn't even put it in my book because the more I read about it and talked to people about is it physically possible? And at this time that Anne says she did it, Anne's a kid. She's just a little girl. And like I said, Anne exaggerates and she's a braggadocio herself. So I didn't even put it in there. I think I footnoted something to it, but it's one of those that even I roll my eyes. Oh, Anne. Okay, next question. Yes?
Where is Anne buried?
Anne is buried, I'll tell that story too. Anne is buried in the family cemetery on the family ranch in Browns Park. And the story goes that Frank Willis, her second husband, Anne was cremated in 1956. And Frank Willis, who was quite a few years older than her, was so heartbroken that he could not bury her ashes. So for the next almost 10 years before he dies, he carries this box of her ashes in the trunk of his car. And nobody knows it until he dies, and it's Josie who helps bury Frank that finds this box in the trunk of Frank's car, and it's labeled Anne. So Josie scatters the ashes in the family cemetery in Browns Park. And the reason why she scattered was because Anne is pretty well known, and they don't want anybody to vandalize the cemetery. Another story, and I don't know if it's true, is that there was a lump in the ashes, and they think that it's because when she was cremated, they forgot to take this big gold ring off of her that she had, and they think it's this kind of molded, kind of lumpy thing. Yes?
So, who inherited Josie's land and Anne's land?
Who inherited Anne's land and Josie's land? Anne's land was inherited by her younger brother, Ed. And I don't have the year off the top of my head, but after Anne and Frank moved to Utah, Ed starts losing the land for whatever reason. It goes into foreclosure. Ed is so distraught about it that he commits suicide. He takes a strychnine pill and commits suicide. By the time Anne and Josie can go through all the paperwork and kind of figure out what's going on, it's too late. Anne does get a piece of it back, a portion of it, which is to the west side and where the cemetery is. And she gets that back from the National Park Service, and the rest of it today is BLM land. Now Josie, her land goes to her son Crawford, after she dies, and to be quite honest, I didn't follow it up after that. I don't know. At some point, because now the state of Utah has it, so at some point that's what happens to it. Because they are the gatekeepers of it now. Anyone else? Yes?
There's a musical that premiered and is running right now at DCPA about Rattlesnake Cape. In fact, whether you were aware of it or...
No, I don't know anything about it.
That's running right now until I think March 14th.
And where?
At Denver Center of Performing Arts.
Oh! Well, I'll have to check into that. I do not know that. I do not know that.
What? Repeat it.
What's the question?
Can you repeat his info?
Can you repeat what he said?
Apparently there's a musical at the Denver Center for Performing Arts, and he's wondering if it's about the cattle cape rattlesnake cape that I talk about, and I don't know.
It is. It's about Rattlesnake.
Oh, it is?
Yes.
It is about rattlesnake cape. Well, that's good to know.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay, anybody else? Yes?
What in the world happened to little Horne Haley?
Ah! What in the world happened to Ora Haley? Good old Ora Haley, Catwoman. Ora Haley, after Anne is acquitted for the second time, the people of Browns Park had really championed Anne and believed in Anne, and most of the small ranchers did too. And they pretty much had their fill of Ora Haley and all the big cattle barons. And then it was shortly after that that the big hubbub happened in Wyoming that his gun for hire, Tom Horne, is arrested for murdering 14-year-old Willie Nichols. So all of this kind of coincides, and Ora Haley starts slowly selling off his land. He sells everything, the two-bar ranch in Browns Park. He's got a second two-bar ranch in Wyoming. He does keep that. It's by Laramie. But he buys, and I just found this out a couple years ago in my research, he buys a mansion on Grant and 16th Street in Denver. I had no idea. And he died there. I can't think of what year he died off the top of my head. But he died in that mansion. That mansion is still there. It's like a lot of the Denver mansions. It's office workers and that kind of thing now. Yes?
You have any idea what the population of Browns Park was?
At that time or now? What the population of Browns Park was at that time, I do not know. It was fairly small. Well, I don't know. There were a lot of families there, a lot of small ranchers there. The town of Craig was the closest town. They all had to come to Craig to do their shopping, and both Josie and Anne go to school in Craig. So it's just a remote ranching town. So I don't know the exact population now. Yes?
In the book where the Old West stayed young, it talks about the trial of Anne, where she was quickly acquitted. And it said that one of the things that happened was that Horne had claimed in the trial that he had, I'm going to make this number up for a second, like 15,000 head of cattle, but that Anne's lawyer produced a piece of paper that said that he paid taxes on that said he had like 1,500 head of cattle, and the lawyer said, well, clearly you're a liar, we've established that, so why are we having the trial? And they acquitted her. Can you confirm or deny that?
I've read the same thing, and there in some of the transcripts, it's in there too. So that is true, and he's commenting on the trial. I can't remember if it's the first trial or the second trial. That one of the questions they asked Ora Haley on the stand is how much taxes did you pay? And he overinflates. He says less on the stand than he actually did, or the other way around. And then the attorney says, well, then you're lying, and they got him for that. Another story about before the trial happened, she gets the best attorney in Weld County. She comes over here to Steamboat to get him. And he doesn't want to take the case. He doesn't want to take this woman's case and the cattle rustling case. And she says, well, what's your price? And so he throws out this number. No, she's just a small rancher. She can't do it. $1,000 retainer fee. So she pulls up her dress. She takes down her stocking and she pulls out a roll of bills. And she's peeling off $100 bills and hands him $1,000 retainer. Yep. Those are some of the many stories of why I love Ann Bassett. She's a hell of a woman. Well, thank you so very much for listening to me.